Ladies and gentlemen, last time we talked about the first years of the Stalin dictatorship and the Second October Revolution over which he presided. This was a revolution from above, a revolution imposed on Russian society, Soviet society, the Soviet peoples, by the state. It consisted, as we found last time, of two components. There was a 5-year plan for industry, which was actually realized in 4 years. It consisted of large, gargantuan, in fact, projects, some of which were rational and some not. The other component of the 5-year plan was collectivization of agriculture, which entailed the identification of so-called kulaks in the countryside, their arrest, their liquidation, that's Stalin's term, as a class. And it entailed also, in Ukraine and other parts of the country, resistance. Some of it, as in Ukraine, massive resistance. This was a resistance that the state met with horrific force. In 1932-33, it sealed the borders of Ukraine and imposed what Ukrainian historians rightly have called, I think, a terror famine. The consequences of the first 5-year plan and the first years of the Stalin dictatorship are enormous. And in a sense, they are incalculable. First of all, industrial advance and collectivization meant an end to the new economic policy and the beginning of a long period of planned economy. Call it, if you will, command economy, because the economy was supposed to respond to the dicta of the state planning agency and the party that stood behind it. Consider also that the first 5-year plan and the ones that follow it meant that regional particularisms in the economic sense were leveled out, and from this point on, the Soviet economy became more and more uniform. In fact, more and more interdependent over time, because Stalin devised the plan in such a way so that one part of the country, one national element, if you will, was dependent upon what was happening in any number of other national groups or areas. So this interdependence, which begins with the first 5-year plan and becomes a feature of the Soviet system, explains, it seems to me, features of the present day, the difficulties of the Russian economy now to right itself after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Collectivization also meant, it seems to me, that Soviet control, party control, urban control over the peasantry would be guaranteed for the foreseeable future. To put it in more colloquial language, Stalin had crushed the peasantry, and there was little hope of resistance for the foreseeable future emanating from the peasants. And in fact, in 1932, the passport law, which came right at the end of collectivization, imposed something like a second serfdom on the peasants of the Soviet Union. What I mean to say here is that every peasant was rooted in place in the collective in which he or she was assigned and could not leave that collective without permission from the state. So this was a rootedness to the land that was no less real than the state of juridical serfdom that had existed in Russia before 1861. So from the point of view of the peasantry, collectivization was not a progressive, it was a regressive, indeed a reactionary development. Now let us pause for a moment and think about the impact of collectivization on Stalin himself. This is a topic that is interesting in its own right, and it leads us into our subject for today, which is Stalin and the so-called Great Terror of the 1930s. In a sense, Stalin was a victor. He had designed, either wholly or in part, the 5-year plan. He had triumphed over his opposition in the party in order to impose this plan. He could stand, therefore, before the nation in 1932 and 1933, and you say, you see, the revolution which I promised has been delivered. 90% of the peasantry has been put into collective farms. The targets of the 5-year plan have been achieved in 4 years, and therefore I am triumphant and the party is triumphant. However, if we look just at the human cost of collectivization, if we look at the suffering in Ukraine, if we look at the nearly 1 million people in Kazakhstan that may have died, if we look at reports from party officials at the time from the lower levels about what was going on and read between the lines, we see that there was a danger for Stalin as well, because even the party which had carried out the policy was shaken by the human consequences that the first 5-year plan and collectivization entailed. Now let me try to describe in some greater detail precisely the kind of ramification politically for Stalin that this trepidation of the party caused by the 5-year plan generated. In 1932, there was a kind of unexpected and I would say not unprecedented development in Soviet history, but unprecedented in Stalin's term as the preeminent leader of the party. And that was that a second-rank party official, a man named Rutin, wrote a manuscript of some 100 pages, which consisted of an indictment of the Stalin dictatorship, he used this term, of the first 5-year plan and the heavy-handed tactics that were employed by the party, of the terrible economic consequences that Rutin believed were caused by the first 5-year plan. And then Rutin condensed this 100-page or so indictment of Stalin into 7 pages, which put the charges in their most forceful form. And this document, which historians retrospectively have called the Rutin Platform, circulated, unpublished of course, but produced by lithograph or copied by hand, circulated in the higher apparatus of the party. Stalin became aware of this. Rutin was arrested, and Stalin was so furious with Rutin that he asked the party high committees to agree to capital punishment to be imposed on Rutin. Now, inside of the party, up to this point, capital punishment was surprisingly a taboo. People had been removed from their position. They had fallen into political disgrace. In the case of Trotsky, they had been exiled, sent abroad, and so on. But in the case of Rutin, Stalin felt that his personal control of the party was being challenged and that the punishment should be capital punishment. And this was a case in which the party powers refused to go along with Stalin's request. And probably there was a good deal of self-interest in their decision. Complaints about collectivization may have reached into Stalin's own family. In 1932, at the 7th of November celebration of the revolution, that's of course now on the Gregorian calendar, because after the revolution the party had switched from the old Russian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, so this is really the 25th of October revolution celebration, same thing. There was a banquet in the Kremlin, And there was a scene between Stalin and his wife. This was his second wife. Stalin flicked a cigarette in her direction, made rude remarks. She marched off home infuriated at this public humiliation, and the next day she was found dead of a gunshot wound. Now it is said that she committed suicide, but it was rumored in the Kremlin that there was a scene at home and that Stalin shot her to death. And there were also rumors that the reason for her anger was not just the personal vulgarity that she experienced from her husband in this public setting, but also because she believed the collectivization campaign had gone too far. And she whispered words to this effect to some of her friends amongst the Kremlin wives, and she may have approached Stalin himself about this. In 1933, the very great Russian poet Osip Mandelstam wrote a poem that has got the nickname the Kremlin Mountaineer. And he refers to Stalin's dictates as stony words falling on those who hear them. He speaks of Stalin's fat fingers. The word is interesting because it's both fat and greasy, leaving traces on everything that it touches. And the last line of the poem says that every killing is a treat for the broad-chested Osset. Stalin was Ossetian, that is a part of a tribe in Georgia in the south, and not a native Russian. Now this poem, which Mandelstam recited one time to a group of friends, was immediately memorized by somebody in that group and was then leaked to the secret police, and this led to Mandelstam's denunciation and to one of his arrests. He was ultimately in 1938 to die in the camps. So here again, there was evidence that the literati were registering the overkill, I choose this term carefully, involved in collectivization. Now in 1934, the party met at one of its congresses. These are bodies that happen every 4 to 5 years, usually every 5 years. And they are legislative. They lay down the line for the next 5 years so that they would approve the 5-year plan, for example. But they are also an elective organ of the party. Now, at the 17th Party Congress in 1934, there was an election to high positions in the party. The number of candidates was equal, of course, to the number of posts to be filled, so there was no danger that somebody was going to be removed by this electoral process from the position that the Central Committee of the party had slated for them. However, it was within the power of the individual delegate to mark a line through the name of any member on the ballot whom that delegate didn't approve. And what we find are these results, that of the about 1,200 delegates, 1,225 to be exact, according to one account, that of Robert Tucker, 100 struck out Stalin's name. Only 3 struck out the name of the favorite of the party, the Leningrad party secretary, a man called Sergei Mironich Kirov. Now, according to Dmitry Volkogonov, who was a historian in the Gorbachev era, he was given access to theretofore unopened archives. According to Volkogonov, the number of people that crossed out Stalin's name was actually higher. Volkogonov says nearly 300. Well, we don't know the exact number because the results, that is, the ballots themselves, were destroyed after the election on Stalin's order. And we know that the results were never announced, that is, the official results, to the party Congress because they were embarrassing to the leader of the party. Now, whence came this apparent opposition from within the party? Tucker's theory is that regional party secretaries got together and they orchestrated this opposition. Now, you ask, what is a regional party secretary? In terms of our system, it's something like a governor of a state. It is, the regions are very large territories, and the regional secretary in that area is like a plenipotentiary who is in charge of carrying out the instructions of the central party in that given region, and also has a wide amount of discretion. Now, if Tucker is right, there was within the party at a high level a substantial amount of opposition to Stalin amongst those who had actually, in the localities, carried out the collectivization and the first five-year plan. The problem from Stalin's point of view is who? Since the ballots were simply lined out, it was impossible to tell who had voted against him and who had not. And this means that everybody at the party Congress is under suspicion. And in fact, if you take this 1,225 people and you look over the next several years at the numbers of them that were purged, you find that more than 80% were killed by 1938. So this was a vengeance, a personal vengeance, I think, of extraordinary magnitude. Now, of course, Stalin in the first instance focused on Kirov, who was the person whose name was lined out only 3 times, who was younger, who was not full of himself, as Trotsky had been, rather more modest, a simple man, absolutely dedicated to the party, somebody who maybe had doubts about collectivization, although they weren't expressed in public. Stalin, there was no difference between the two that one could see, but the manner of Kirov was softer. People looked at him and they thought, this is not the same kind of extremist, hardcore person that Stalin was. Stalin, of course, is a nickname and it means man of steel. Kirov was not that sort. It was rumored at the party Congress that Kirov might someday be an alternative to Stalin. Now, Kirov was no dummy. He understood that the existence of such rumors would be a danger to himself, that they must be known to Stalin, and so he came to Stalin. And one would have liked to have been a little fly on the wall to watch this meeting. It said that Kirov said, you know, Joseph Vissarionovich, people say that I have possibly the talent to be considered an alternate, and I wouldn't think that I could possibly replace you. And Stalin is said to have said, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. But the look in his eye and the intonation in his voice must have been rather threatening. Stalin apparently drew the conclusion that the party must be purged at the highest level, that his opponents, whoever they were, especially Kirov, must be eliminated. And this was a conclusion that must have been supported by the police network that had been so much involved in the carrying out of the first five-year plan and collectivization. It must have been supported by very many younger people in the party. Why? Well, they stood to benefit. You start eliminating more prominent people, and plums suddenly are available for the gathering. I hasten to emphasize, therefore, that although Stalin probably conceived the purges as an instrument of his revenge against those who had opposed him in 1934 and for his own political survival, that he was not solely responsible. After all, he had to depend on other people to carry out his task. And this notion of responsibility, how much is a personal responsibility of Stalin and how much belongs to the party, is something that I think will be important as historians have more and more access to the archives of the 1930s. Now, always great events, especially sad and great events, have what look to be trivial causes. Let me talk about the fate of Mr. Kirov, who on the 1st of December 1934 was murdered, was assassinated. From the point of view of the party, this is a sad development, but it is, after all, only one person. The party had lost Lenin, unsurvived. Trotsky was dispensable. So the loss of somebody like Kirov in the long wash should not have been particularly alarming. Now, the circumstances of this assassination are murky, but they suggest that the murder was planned by Stalin. Let us look at some of the circumstantial evidence. First of all, we know from Volkogonov and others that in 1934, between the 17th Party Congress meeting and the assassination of Kirov, there were some adjustments made in the secret police organization in Leningrad. A trusted functionary by the name of Zaporozhets was sent to Leningrad from Moscow, and there is a lot of evidence about secret meetings between Zaporozhets and a man called Yagoda, who was then the head of the police agency in Moscow, and perhaps a private meeting with Stalin as well. The killer, the trigger man of Kirov, was a young man, a party member, a divorced party member, named Nikolaev, who was, before the assassination, twice arrested and released on, apparently, the orders of Zaporozhets. And on the second occasion, when he was arrested and released, he carried with him a map of the parade, not the parade route, but the walking route of Kirov in the city. Kirov was a walker. He liked to mingle with the people in center city. And he was, Nikolaev, arrested with a gun. Now, although it was not uncommon for party personnel at the very highest levels to have guns, think of the suicide or murder of Stalin's wife, or the suicide of Ordzhonikidze, a friend of Stalin, who may have been implicated in the opposition in the 17th Party Congress. Although this was not unusual for the highest levels of the party, for a lowly party level person like Nikolaev, it was extremely rare that such a person should have a weapon. And it was against the law. Since the 20s, Soviet citizens had been disarmed. So retrospectively, this was somebody that should have been detained and put into prison. But he was not, apparently, because of instructions from on high. Think about where the murder was committed. It was committed inside the party headquarters in Leningrad itself, at a time when the external guards of the building were Moscow-trained NKVD people who were brought to Leningrad by Zaporozhets. And then after the assassination, Nikolaev was roughed up. He was questioned by Stalin himself, who flew in from Moscow for the occasion. Certain witnesses that might have given an account of the breakdown of security were killed. So there is very strong circumstantial evidence of higher involvement, let us say. Now, maybe 1% chance, say, Stalin didn't conceive the assassination. But whether he did or didn't is less important than the consequences that flowed from this event. In December 1934, there were decrees that were passed that were instruments of state terror. On the 1st of December, the very day of the assassination, the government issued a decree calling for speedy investigation and execution of sentences in cases of terrorism against the state. And these sentences were supposed to be executed without delay. It is said that Stalin himself wrote this decree. On the 5th of December, it was ordered that investigations be concluded in 10 days, that cases could be heard without the participation of the accused, and could be heard before a military tribunal. So, in other words, these kinds of cases weren't going to be prosecuted in civilian courts. They would be held in courts martial, whether the accused was a military person or not, and the accused need not even be present. 5th of December decree also said that capital punishment could be imposed. So by the 5th of December, Stalin had the legal instruments that he would use against his real or imagined opposition during the terror. Now, historians who are always looking for comparisons have said that the decrees of December 1934 are very similar in nature to the so-called enabling act that was passed by the Nazis in 1934 that gave Adolf Hitler supreme power in the Reich. This set of documents, therefore, one enabling Stalin to do what he willed with the opposition, the other giving Hitler's word the force of law, are, from the standpoint of these historians, exactly comparable in terms of their function. They legalized personal dictatorships. Now, we still haven't got quite to the bottom of the events of December 1934, because after the shooting, which Nikolaev confessed he had done, what recourse did he have? Blame was fixed on higher people in the party. And here you see at work Stalin's very interesting, if evil, mind. Stalin had for a long time resented Zinoviev and Kamenev. Now, where did we hear their names the first time in this course? We heard their names when I talked about the vote on the 10th of October 1917 that led to the planning of the October insurrection, where the Bolsheviks seized power. There was a 10-2 vote. And the two dissenters who opposed the insurrection were Kamenev and Zinoviev. From the standpoint of Stalin, this bit of party history was something that could be cited as evidence that all along these people were not true Bolsheviks. And therefore, anyone who was associated with Kamenev and Zinoviev, anyone in their patronage network, was to be considered an enemy of the people. Now, it so happens that Lenin was more forgiving for some reason than Stalin. He permitted Kamenev and Zinoviev to assume high positions in the party. Zinoviev, for a while, was the nominal head of the Communist International. He was, for a time in the 20s, head of the Leningrad Party organization. Stalin had pushed Kamenev and Zinoviev off the Central Committee, but they had still held smaller posts. Well, you can see in the events of 1934 then, a mind looking not just for a pretext to purge the party broadly, but a mind that is vengeful. Somebody that looks at the past as an open book in which the sins of party members could be read plainly. There were, therefore, after the assassination and the implication of Zinoviev and Kamenev, arrests in Leningrad and trials in Leningrad, in which Kamenev and Zinoviev were found guilty of conspiracy against the party and against Stalin personally. 40,000 Leningraders, many of them party officials, were arrested in 1935. This was the beginning of the Great Terror. Now, what historians usually call the terror itself is something that begins in 1934 and ends in 1938. I think that there is that it's a mistake to confine the term terror to those 2 or 3 years. I think one must reach back to 1934 and see the circumstances that led to the terror. But the terror had various characteristics from 36 to 38, and I want to talk about those now. First of all, and most famously, from the point of view of foreigners, there were show trials. In open courts, the accused publicly testified to their guilt, invariably to their guilt, and they seemed to abase themselves competitively, to vie with each other, to share their culpability before the Soviet people. Some of them confessed to involvement in the conspiracy to kill Kirov. Others confessed to various sorts of counter-revolutionary activity, including being in the employ of foreign intelligence agencies. Others confessed that they were guilty of the terrible crime of Trotskyism, although Trotsky himself was long gone from the Soviet Union by this time. The trials for foreign observers were puzzling, mystifying, and people read them in different ways. Some people accepted the testimony at face value. And I have to tell you that amongst those who were gulled was the American ambassador to the Soviet Union in the late 30s, a man called Davies. He sat right next to George Kennan, who was trying to tell him that there's something fishy about these accusations. Kennan, of course, was somebody with a good knowledge of Russian and had good horse sense in the political arena, whereas Davies was merely someone that had given a lot of money to Franklin Roosevelt. He was a Wisconsin lawyer and judge, and his remark was, well, I've seen a lot of guilty people, and these guys look guilty to me. Too bad for American diplomacy. Arthur Koestler, in his great novel Darkness at Noon, which is fiction, but it's also based on his observations of the Bukharin trial, which occurred in 1938, offers a different kind of explanation. He suggests that these people abased themselves and confessed to crimes they never committed because it was explained to them that somehow it was for the good of the party. And party membership created a kind of twisted soul in these people, a sort of perverted desire to confess to sins before the party, in, of course, the hopes that one might thereby be pardoned, that one could be subsequently re-educated, or at least that other people who were auditors of the confession would know how not to behave as a member of the Communist Party. Other people rather more shrewdly guessed that the show trials were simply orchestrated by Stalin, that they were his form of puppet theater. Incidentally, Stalin had a loge which he watched the trial, but he was behind a screen so that he could not be observed in public. Now, out of the show trials, there flowed mass arrests. I like to think of this in terms of a pyramid of terror. At the top, at the apex of the pyramid, there are the few people who are accused, actually, in the show trials. But beneath, there's everyone in the patronage organization and everyone that's somehow associated with the principal accused or with other people who are subsequently classified as enemies of the people. So the terror grows geometrically. And at a certain point, it loses all rationality and becomes completely arbitrary. Because what person is not associated, if they are a high party official, with X or Y who are accused? So there's arbitrariness almost from the very beginning. When we discuss the moral responsibility for these purges, numbers become important. Now we know, for example, from Volkogonov, that on the 12th of December 1938, Stalin approved the shooting of 3,167 people. Volkogonov has seen the lists with the names on them, Stalin's signature. I don't know how many times he had to sign his name to get 3,167 victims on this day, but we know that after this he went to the movies. Here is a case of personal responsibility. But if you look at below this apex, at the broad base of the pyramid, you find that the numbers are too large to consider Stalin personally responsible. Volkogonov thinks that there are somewhere between 4.5 and 5.5 million arrests between 1936 and 1938. He thinks that there were somewhere between 800,000 and 900,000 death sentences. Now, I'm not sure about how technically he arrives at these conclusions. There is an American historian named Robert Thurston that's just published a book on the terror, and his estimates of arrests and deaths are much lower. But let's just say that there is a huge number, we don't exactly know, of people who were arrested and killed, and Stalin could not have been personally responsible for each and every one of those people. There had to be, now here I'm going to appropriate the phrase from the title of the Holocaust history book that has just appeared, Jonah Goldhagen's book, Hitler's Willing Executioners. There had to be Stalin's willing executioners out there, people who denounced enemies of the people to the police, policemen who heard the denunciations and acted upon them, guards who willingly did their duty, and so on and so forth. So we are not talking about one person responsible. We are talking about many people, tens of thousands at the least, that carried out the Great Terror. The revisionist historian Arch Getty has said, well, the purges weren't directed from Moscow by Stalin. That's a Cold War myth. Actually, at the local level, they had their own flavor. People who were the head of local party organizations carried out the purges according to their own desire for vengeance or their own local needs. I think that that's probably true. I mean, it's consistent with my theory that at the highest level, Stalin was personally responsible. He set off this chain of events that we know as the Great Terror. And at the local level, there was plenty of arbitrariness. I don't see any quarrel, any need for a quarrel with Getty on that point. We know from various accounts that there was little resistance to arrests. Why is that the case? A lot of people accepted the government's propaganda. Kirov was killed by people high in the party. There was something rotten in the state of Denmark. A fish rots from the head, you know. And so they believed the confessions in public, and they didn't resist when arrest happened to their neighbors or to members of their family or themselves. It is also the case that if you wanted to resist arrest, how could you? Where were the possibilities of organization against the state? They simply didn't exist by this time in Stalinist Russia. Now, once people were arrested, they were put in a prison camp system that was quite efficient and quite cruel. Volkogonov has said that the capacity of the prisons was about 750,000 inmates. Once people were processed, that is, tried, they were sent to their destinations. In some cases, those held in Lubyanka could be taken across the street to the Rastrelny Dom, the shooting house that was owned by the Ministry of Justice Military Collegium, and in the basement of that building they were shot. And then the bodies at night were carted to the Andronikov Monastery in Moscow and buried there under cover of night. Or people were sent to the hard labor camps. Volkogonov thinks that the capacity of the labor camps at any one time was between 2.1 and 2.5 million inmates. Camp survivors tell us that the camps were inhumane in some respects. Guards were cruel and arbitrary, but occasionally there were acts of human kindness. A prison doctor might permit somebody that really wasn't sick to be given a rare day of sick leave. Zhenya Ginsburg was the beneficiary of such treatment by a camp doctor in Kolyma. Camps were supposed to re-educate prisoners. They really didn't, I think. They were simply punitive. And the worst of the punitive camps, according to Robert Conquest, who has studied the subject quite thoroughly, was in the far north and the far east, the very tip of the Soviet Union near Alaska, in an area called Kolyma. Conquest thinks that over the whole course of the Stalin period, from the late 20s to 1953, about 3 million people died at Kolyma. So this makes the numbers, if they're accurate, higher than Auschwitz. Inevitably, we are left with comparisons again, comparisons with that other frightful regime, the Nazi regime. We can say that in both systems there was a dictator, a leader, a Führer. We can say in both countries there were mass mobilizing parties. In both countries there were enemies or scapegoats of the party. In both countries, for a time, terror was a central principle of political life. Of course, the Holocaust was unique. No one wants to gainsay that. It was a racial set of murders, and it is abhorrent for that reason and simply on humane grounds. But I submit to you that in its own unique way, what happened in the Soviet Union was perhaps equally abhorrent And unfortunately, we cannot call it unique. It was something that was actually emulated, unlike the Holocaust, in Cambodia, in China, and elsewhere. What a world, what a world.